smuggling something else on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue.
I want to slightly disagree with that. I mean, not entirely disagree with that. I think that you cannot separate politics from the courts. You cannot separate electoral activity and activism from the courts. And why is that? Well, that's the third sense of constitutionality, counting to 5 votes. One of the things that the supporters of this bill are depending upon is that the Supreme Court generally defers to Congress. And it especially defers to Congress when Congress has enacted something that's very popular and that enjoys widespread support, or that's considered to be necessary for the national security of the country. There's all these imperatives that get brought to bear on the Supreme Court, which causes them to give the benefit of the doubt to their co-equal branch, the legislative branch of Congress. Now, that's all true, but that equation changes when a bill turns out either not to be necessary to the security of the country or very, very unpopular. So the situation that the court would face when a challenge comes up there in 2 years, let's say a year or two it takes to get there, the situation that the court would face, if they're looking, for example, after Congress, one or both branches of Congress has changed hands, flip parties as a result of public objections to this measure, and perhaps there is a repeal bill that is enacted by both houses and vetoed by the president, or is filibustered in the Senate. And that's the political posture in which the court then takes up a constitutional challenge based on the serious arguments that I've outlined to you today. A court viewing or evaluating constitutionality under those circumstances, it would be much easier to count to 5 justices who would hold such a measure unconstitutional. And this works, by the way, in reverse. When you're running for Congress or you're running for office, it's very important to be able to object to the unwise policy of the Obamacare legislation. But it's also very helpful to be able to object to the unconstitutionality of this bill and to vow to repeal an unconstitutional bill, not just an unwise bill. And if these arguments are serious, as I believe they are, that also gives congressmen something to run on when they're running for re-election. It will give the next presidential candidate something to discuss in the next round of presidential debates, and that adds a dimension that wouldn't be there if these bills were not unconstitutional. So the constitutional side plays into the political side, and the political side plays into the constitutional side, and the two cannot be entirely separated.
I thought we weren't allowed to talk about judges being politicians, right? Let's go to we have time for a few more questions. Yes, Fred. Wait for the microphone, Fred.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, with regards to the precedent that would be set, if the individual mandate is upheld, would there be, I mean, at that point, would there be anything that Congress couldn't mandate you purchase?
It would be difficult to find, once the precedent is set, that once this line is crossed and now Congress can mandate that you engage in economic activity because doing so is necessary to a broader regulatory scheme, then so long as they enact a broad regulatory scheme, they can mandate you do anything. And that might, for example, include mandating that you, instead of paying you to buy, cash for clunkers, where they actually have to raise tax money and spend it to bribe you into buying a new car, it would be much cheaper for them just to mandate that you buy a new car. And even better, if they could mandate that you buy a car that's owned from a company that happens to be owned by the federal government. That would even be better and more likely in the interests of the national welfare, which is that you buy a GM car. So you can understand how all of those things could also be necessary too, as long as they're deemed to be proper. So it's very important that we focus on the impropriety of this kind of law, not simply on its supposed necessity.
Let me say, I bought a car last weekend and it was a Ford, and they didn't take any TARP money. Seriously speaking, the political process does work. And I remember being one of a small minority in 1988 that voted against something that called catastrophic health insurance. Well, it was a catastrophe for senior citizens. Chairman Rostenkowski was chased down the street by a bunch of angry senior citizens, and the next year it was repealed. So this is going to be a political debate, but my definition of enacting something into law is something that actually makes it into law, which requires either the signature of the President of the United States or overriding a presidential veto. Now, you know, the courts aren't going to get way out there, and I agree with Professor Barnett that counting to 5 votes is, you know, they look at trends as closely as we do, even though our jobs are on the line every 2 years and theirs never are. But having said that, you know, there is no question in my mind that the vast majority of American people are furious at the enactment of this law. And when the debate started out, it was a 70% issue, and now it's a 30% issue. And the President and those who have supported this legislation, I think, are realizing that a little bit of knowledge on the part of the American public is a very dangerous thing.
There's one other thing about the lawsuits and how they play into the politics of the situation is the lawsuits do keep the political issue alive. I mean, otherwise, what supporters of all legislation count on is once the bill is passed, it's done. Now, you all are asked to move on. But as long as these lawsuits exist, provided they are based on real, solid, constitutional analysis, if they're frivolous lawsuits, this won't work. But if they're not frivolous, that does keep the issues alive, both in the legal process, but also in the political process.
But doesn't that mean we have to pass it first so that the people will find out what's in it? Nancy Pelosi?
Any other questions?
Are you two the only two who've ever read the damn thing?
The Constitution.
I wasn't given a chance to read 2,700 pages up on the internet. You know, even, you know, I got good glasses, but you know they have a limit. But you know, in terms of the explanation on how things work, no matter what kind of reiteration they had between the House bill and the Senate bill and the Senate bill and the reconciliation fix-up bill, the basic parts of this bill remained the same. And that's where the constitutional questions come up. It's not how they tweak the language or how they tried to cover over their mistakes in the reconciliation bill or subsequent Joint Tax Committee staff reports. The way it works is the way they intended it to work, and that's where the deficiencies are, both from a constitutional standpoint as well as a policy standpoint.
I mean, I don't know if we're ending here, but let me just say, one of the things that I think you have to keep in mind is that this bill, this scheme that's created by this bill is really very messy, and there's a good chance that it isn't going to work very well, which I think was not wholly unintended. I think the true aim of people who supported this bill really was to get to a single-payer provision, and to the extent this doesn't work, then the solution is not going to be repealing. It's going to be moving all the way to where they said you should go in the first place. So you need to keep that in mind. And you also, I think you also need to keep in mind, I mean, I think supporters of this bill should certainly not count on the court upholding it. But opponents of this bill should not count on the court striking it down. The smart money is always that the court will uphold an act of Congress, not that it will strike it down, because of the presumption of constitutionality that the Congressman has already mentioned. So you should not put your faith in the court if you oppose this bill to strike it down in the courts, even though I think there's a good chance or a reasonable chance that they will. This has got to be, if you oppose this bill, a political question, a political matter, to be continued, a discussion to be continued in the political sphere, even if that means passing a bill that gets, a repeal bill that gets vetoed and then becomes the basis for the next election. This is a long process. Unfortunately, it's not over. Or maybe fortunately it's not over, but it doesn't, but do not rely and do not walk away from this program thinking that the courts are going to ride to your rescue, because by and large that is not the case. It's not something you can count on.
Congressman, any final thoughts?
We have a time limit in the House. The clock runs faster for Republicans than Democrats on the Speaker's watch. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for coming as well. This will be available on the internet for all time on YouTube eventually. And again, I appreciate the valuable time given freely to us by the Congressman and Professor Barnett. Thank you all as well.